Wait. Let me adjust my lights.
He's got to be the prettiest boy on the podcast.
Prettiest boy.
It's bright as hell in my office right now, as you can see. Everything's bright. I have 4 windows in here.
I use my like key lights as like the sad light. Like I turn them to full blast in the morning and 5800K, and I'm like, it's the sun.
Now that can be the intro.
It's the sun.
It's the sun. Ooh, or another soundboard clip. Ooh, I like that idea.
This is true.
Ian going, it's the sun.
It's the sun.
It can it can match our
ding. It feels like I'm saying it.
Welcome to Fall Through. I probably already did an intro or something like that. So we're here with our panel, regular panel, no introduction. Today we're talking about APIs, API design, API implementation, maybe some API testing. We shall see. And joining us to talk about APIs is the wonderful Jamie Tanna. How are you doing today, Jamie?
Hey, I'm doing great.
And for our listeners that don't know who you are, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Jamie. I'm a senior software engineer at Elastic, and I'm working on things like engineering productivity. But over like the last decade, I've spent a load of time in the API space. I am a blogger. You may know me from some of my lukewarm takes. And I am most recently the co-maintainer of the OpenAPI to Go code generator, or API CodeGen, which we spoke about on Go Time a while back as well.
Yes, I remember that episode. That was a fun episode.
So I'll ask Jamie, like, what's your stance on versioning? When is a change, whether you're using like URL pathing or whether you're using content negotiation, when does a change become a breaking change? And how does that affect how you see versioning for your API? Like, what are your thoughts there?
So it's a breaking change if there are, for instance, fields that used to be required that are now optional or not even present. And bits like that, but also more importantly, if the behavior changes, and that is less easy to work out because
behavior being like backend, how it's stored or processed, or what do you mean when you say behavior there?
Yeah, so and so for instance, like if you're saying, trying to think up an example. So say I want to create a new user. If that in like the V1 API creates the user and actually does some like early onboarding steps or something like that, or like sends an onboarding email maybe. If in your V2 API you just create the user and then there's like a location header that's returned that or something which then you as the client need to go in and then trigger the onboarding step, or there's something slightly different that happens with that onboarding email. I would say that is a break and change, because even though it may not be explicitly relied on by one of the consumers, it is definitely a change in underlying behavior. That's one of the harder things that isn't necessarily documented in your like API description. It is something that consumers may be relying on, may need to be aware of.
I remember a lot of debates around this subject when Go modules came out with semantic import versioning. There are lots of breaking changes that aren't breaking from the standpoint of API signatures, and it's very difficult to convey that in the simplified model of a single symver string and semantic import versioning.
You know, we're going to have to like come up with like a tone or something that plays whenever any of us does one of the classic things we do, like when I go in a monologue or when Dylan talks about semantic import versioning. Like there's going to be some like noise encounter, because this is
It can be Matt's ding.
Ding. That was me. That wasn't the soundboard.
That wasn't the soundboard. That was Matt.
No, I mean, but so like,
but that's a very nuanced area of discussion. Like, versioning is important, but versioning is not just your API signatures. You can break an API by preserving the signature, but changing the semantic behavior of what that API does.
so how are we telling clients this then, right? Like, how are we communicating the version changing? Because we've talked about this earlier in the conversation where we said that, you know, your original storage model can leak, and then your business next week or next month's going to change because your CTO said we're going in the AI route or doing, you know, they pivot. How do you handle that then, right? Like, because it's going to happen. The change is coming, and your API, the way you designed it yesterday, is no longer relevant. It needs to be changed for today's users. How do you communicate that version to your clients, and how do you like bring the old clients forward with you into the new and greatest way of doing things?
I mean, I think the naive version of that is you just stack towers and towers of new endpoints, and eventually you say, "Hey, that old one's gonna stop working," right?
But it never. But does it though? Like,
Well, no, you
does it
end up
ever
with-
stop working?
Like, I can go look at our like main monolith API endpoint list, and it's like 800 of them, right?
Yeah.
And 400 of those are probably old and no one uses them, but they stick around because maybe someone uses them. And hot take here, I don't have the biggest issue with that. Like,
Sticking,
in a lot of-
like having many routes stay alive.
Yeah.
Okay.
In a lot of ways, it's easier. Like, the change management of that is actually easier than trying to version APIs. Just like building, like, I mean, it's the same strategy as /v2/v3, right? That's not versioning your API. That's building new endpoints. Those aren't the same endpoints, right? And like, it's not the most technically correct, but I do think for your customers, it's the easiest to migrate. It's the easiest to understand.
Yeah, it's
hot
it's
take,
understandable
but-
and it's comprehensible. Like, it makes sense to a human.
Yeah,
So
if I have
one
to
of
tell
my-
my customer our reporting API, you now have to send this weird version header, and it's you got to negotiate the version and everything. They're going to be like, we're not going to use this. I need to be able to put this in a ETL job. I actually can't even change the body. Can you give me an option to give me the last 7 days? Right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. One of my, and not so much anymore, but back in my Windows days, one of my favorite blogs it's called The Old New Thing. It's from a guy on the Windows team. His name is Raymond Chen, and he's on the compatibility team. And he wrote for years these explanations about the Herculean efforts that the Windows team have done over the years to make sure that Lotus 123 from 1994 still works on Windows 11. So at that level, kind of, it does cross over into the concept of API versioning and kind of, like you said, stacking endpoints. And like, you have these millions of consumers, if you're wildly successful, who realistically, you can't get all of them to switch. So you have to account for it on your end.
They don't
and
care
say,
about
well,
your tech debt.
Yes. They will. They're not going to switch. What they have works for them. So like you said, your internal refactor, if it breaks them, then you're, for lack of a nicer way to put it, you're failing at your job.
I don't know if I agree with that, but I want to hear.
disagree.
Yeah, I want to hear other people's thoughts around this.
So I wrote a thing. I wrote a little. I call it a thought about this because I think I mentioned.
Dare
I've mentioned
say
it many
monologue?
times. It's a monologue from my head. Ding.
Thanks, Ian.
No, so I've thought about this problem a lot because like it bothers me that like you almost wind up feeling held hostage by your customers because you don't want to let them down, or your consumers really. They're not necessarily customers. You don't want to let them down, and they obviously don't want to change things, or maybe can't change things without an impetus, right? Like they won't change something unless there's a reason for them to change it. So if you're just like, hi, please move over to my new API, they're like, I have a giant backlog. So unless I have to, no. And there's a way we deal with this in the broader world, and they're called contracts, right? You write down a contract, and both sides have to agree, this is what we've agreed on. And what we essentially do now is we have a contract, but the contract says you get to use this thing in perpetuity, right? I mean, I know we sneak into the terms of service and things like that say like, oh, we can turn this off whenever we want. But like the kind of social contract or like the in effect contract we have is you get to use this for as long as you want. And I think one of the things we should do is start just having explicit contracts that say, hello, you can use this API. Like here are the endpoints you get to use for this amount of time. And you can encode that as like, you know, a token that they send, or can be encoded into API tokens that get generated. You can implement it however you want. And you know, at the end of that time, maybe it's a year, they can renew the contract. You say, okay, yes, we're going to support these API endpoints for the next year. Here's your new contract. But if at the end of that contract, you're like, well, actually, we don't want to maintain these APIs anymore, well, then you go into contract negotiation. So then you sit down with the other side and you say, okay, well, we don't want to support this API anymore because, you know, it's costing us a lot of money or it's a lot to maintain. So we'll allow you to keep using it, but here's how much it's going to cost you. Like, it will add an addendum to your contract and say, this is how much money you're going to have to pay us if you want to keep using these endpoints. And then the consumers can say, okay, I'll pay that, or no, I don't want to pay that. And if they don't want to pay that, then okay, well, here's the new contract. It doesn't have these API endpoints. If you call them, you will get rejected. And like, you will get rejected, and so and here you go. But if they do want it, it's like, okay, well, here you go, and give you the money, and then you're done, right? And you do that for each individual consumer you have. Obviously, you can automate this however you want, and you can, you know, make the contracts however, you know, in depth that you want them to be. But fundamentally, the problem we have here is that not everybody is I don't think we're going into this with a mindset of, oh, this is a contract, and I don't think we're all purposely making in perpetuity contracts. And we need to get away from ourselves making in perpetuity contracts, because obviously we would all like to change things in the future. This also gets you away from necessarily having to shove versions or even content type anything into headers or anything like that, because the API token or the contract token can say what version of the API you're using, right? You can get a new contract that says, okay, this is the V2 contract, and now the API tokens generated from this contract will be processed using the V2 API, and your old contract is the V1 API, and then you choose in your application which token you get, and that will tell you, that will inform the application which version to send back to you. So it definitely can solve the versioning problem, but it also solves this larger problem of being able to clean out some of those older things that you have, because there is a big problem of, is this API still used? I don't have a way of definitively knowing that. But you can say, if you look in the contract database, no one has a valid contract for this API endpoint, then you know you can get rid of it, or you can repurpose it for whatever you want.
And yeah, I guess one of my concerns with that is friction. So there's, first of all, you need to have all that data available, which, like, scrappy young startup maybe isn't going to have that. But even like large enterprises aren't generally building that sort of information into new things they're building. It's also like, say I want to come and play around with your API. Do I now have to go through a contract negotiation to just get an API key to play around with it the first time?
No, not necessarily. You could have just you could have a shared contract or an automatic contract that's just like, oh, it's like the same way you get API tokens, right? There doesn't have to be something necessarily different in that flow. You could be like, here's your API credential, this is how long it lasts, and oh, here's the documentation about what you're allowed to call with it. And when you regenerate it, that documentation might be different, basically.
I feel like there could be a simpler but maybe more workable version of that, kind of built around the idea of, here's the current published version of this API. It's Q1 2025. As a vendor, as a service provider, we will support that version of the API for 1 year, and we'll guarantee that. But in Q1 of 2026, those APIs are now subject to breakage. And it kind of solves the implicit in perpetuity thing that leads to all the nasty compatibility shims in Windows to make DOS programs from 1980 still work. But without all the extra infrastructure requirement that Jamie was calling out, kind of now you have to go build that in and have the system in place to go provision contracts for every user and store their API tokens. And kind of, there's a lot of investment, potentially a lot of investment to get that working, that a lot of early stage systems just don't have the time or the resources to build.
So what you described still fits within what I was talking about, right? That's just you can conceptually understand it as there's only one contract that is negotiated with everybody. And when it's like terms of service, right? You don't write terms of service for each individual user of your website, but terms of service is still a contract. So you can have a contract that is just with anybody that uses your service that is like, okay, well, there's no negotiation for it. Like, here's what it is. Here's the API endpoints. After a year, we get to break all of them if we so choose. That's what it is, right? But I think the thing about it is that it puts an explicitness on the whole situation, which I think will shift people's minds over time about how they use APIs and how they consume APIs and how they build their own applications as well, and what they are telling their customers. Because I think a lot of the time it's, oh, I need this API because my customers use this specific thing in my application, and I haven't told my customers that this app might stop working, right? That's a thing that is less now that we're all subscription based, but definitely was a thing in the past where people would buy an app and they'd be like, I get to use this app forever. But it's like, well, that's not really reasonable if people want to deprecate things that, are underneath you or are not directly in you as an app developer's control. This also opens up the opportunity for, if you do wind up selling an app and like you as a person, you're like, I don't maintain this version of the app anymore, but someone or maybe some big enterprise is like, no, we really need this, but it's an app for a third party thing. Maybe they can go to that third party and be like, okay, we want our own contract. And as long as you've put configurability in your app, they can put their own contract token in there. So that you as a developer don't have to get involved at all. You don't have to go back and care about this old version of the app. They can keep using it because they've negotiated directly with the API provider. So it opens up that opportunity as well. So it's definitely, this idea is a very broad one. It takes the broadest understanding of what a contract could be, right? Like in contract law, if I just say, oh, let's do this thing, we get we handshake, that's a contract. So it doesn't have to be some like in-depth, you have lawyers and negotiation, it takes months to do it. It doesn't have to be that. It's just the explicitness of, this is what we are providing for this amount of time, and this is your ability to use it.
What I'm hearing here is part of your API design is what happens when this stops working. Right. It's something you need to think about up front, not when you're ready to deprecate something. You were talking about like having an app. Something we ran into at my previous job was we had people on very old versions of iOS apps, right? And we had no way to cleanly deprecate that, right? Like if we change the APIs or get rid of them, that app just breaks in a way we might not understand. So something we implemented was like a minimum version for our APIs that returned like a explicit error that said this app version is no longer supported. So we could pop a message saying like, hey, if you want to keep using our app, you have to update, right? But we couldn't do that on the oldest versions because we hadn't implemented that code. But that's like a lesson you learn, that like you need to think about this stuff up front, like from the beginning. Otherwise,
it's easy,
you're stuck.
Ian. You just go get your time machine and you go back and add that code before you thought about it.
This is a very nuanced, interesting topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it, honestly, because I personally haven't seen someone's API that I'm like, oh, they're doing versioning perfectly right. This is amazing. It sucks to have to say, no, that thing is no longer around. Please migrate to the new thing. And it's hard to convince people that are on the old thing that's working for them to migrate. And it's weird too, because we're in the software field where software is malleable. Like we should be able to change it almost at will. It's not like we constructed a building and it's like, oh man, that V1 design of that column, I really wish we would have did it differently. Like, let's go tear the whole building down. Like, we don't have to do that in software. It's much easier for us to change software, yet we're much like more likely to not change it because we're like, it works, it's fine. It's like, oh, we can go do the thing. And this whole idea of like contracts and versioning and stuff, it kind of almost reminds me of like a restaurant almost, where you go in there and the contract of you eating is whatever's on the menu. And then you go there a month later, the menu has changed and your favorite item that you were used to using is no longer there. And it's either you get the new replacement item that's similar to what you like to eat, or you don't use that API and you don't use that restaurant and you go somewhere else. And it's like, that's kind of what I'm feeling there, but it's communicated. The idea is that the service that's being offered, the food that's being offered is communicated to all the users.
Yeah. I would say, like you said, it's always nuanced and there's gray area around what's the right way to version your API. But I think the most common and the biggest mistake that I see is not versioning at all and discovering a year in that, oh, this needs to change and I don't have a way to version my API. It's almost impossible to bolt versioning on after the fact.
Well, that's why you get /v2s.
To me, the most important thing is you have to think about versioning up front. Whatever your specific implementation of versioning ends up being, there's lots of flexibility there. But you have to account for versioning in your system before there's a breaking change. Because if you need to go add versioning after it's already out there, it's orders of magnitude more difficult. Not impossible, but extremely difficult. As prime example, go introducing major versions and semantic import versioning. One of the bigger problem areas is the V0 versus V1, because there was no explicit difference there. There was no line in the sand to say, now this is V1. That's kind of an example of when you do versioning after the fact, it's much harder. It's much more difficult. It's harder for people to understand. It's harder for you to implement. So if I had to have any bit of advice for anyone, it's think about how you want to handle versioning up front. Like, that's one of your first things that you need to account for.
And don't do whatever Go did with V2 modules. Don't do that. Sorry.
I think as well, like on the topic of like thinking up front for versioning, one of the things that I don't see a lot of people doing is thinking generally upfront and doing a lot of actual designing of the API, considering what sort of things should actually be in there.
You work on OpenAPI Code Gen, right? The project. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is like, maybe does versioning even matter, right? Could we just keep our OpenAPI spec up to date for our APIs and like auto gen our clients and servers and everything's happy and everyone's always on the latest? Yay, we're all happy. Like, is that a world where we can be in where versioning kind of goes away because we're all just on latest? How do you feel about that?
So short answer, no, because people don't keep their OpenAPI specs up to date. And I mean more like on the consumer side. So at my previous company, we had quite a lot of OpenAPI usage, and some of it was because I was the maintainer of OpenAPI Code Gen, so we were trying to do a bit more of it. It was the sort of thing that, like, when a team would first go to integrate with someone else's API, they would generate some code off the spec that they had at that point, and then they wouldn't update that spec until the next time they needed to do a load of work with it. And potentially in that time, there are new API endpoints that are coming in. There are documentation tweaks. There's different things that could be of note. And so I think in that case, because people aren't keeping up to date, it is making that a little bit more difficult. There are ways you can get around that by, like, I've written many a post about it. Like, you can do things like you can sync the OpenAPI spec and then regenerate the SDK. You can generate the SDK in a more central place. There are also lots of vendors that provide very nice SDKs that always update and just like send you PRs to say, hey, this is updated now. But one of the issues is that at some point there is going to be a broken change, and you are going to have to modify the call sites of the underlying code base. And I think that's really the hard thing, is even if we like abstract it out with a Go module that is a nice SDK, at some point someone still needs to go in and make some tweaks to put in some new required parameters or move to a new function call.
So then would you say OpenAPI's usefulness, while it can generate SDKs and whatnot and serves as that, like, you know, that documentation of your API's functionality, would you say the OpenAPI spec is more useful as documentation itself to show the user like what even the API is and how it works? Is OpenAPI an OpenAPI spec enough for documentation? Do I not have to write anything else except for that?
So you can write a good enough OpenAPI spec with like good levels of description and everything in there. I still don't think it's quite enough. And like there's a number of very excellent folks in the API community who are also technical writers, and rightfully so. Are like, you can't just write a YAML file and call it done. Like, there needs to be a little bit more than that. But you can get a good chunk of the way if you have a very reasonable OpenAPI spec with descriptions and summaries and examples, which can then be used by tools to either like generate server-side or client-side boilerplate. You can generate like mocks, so you can actually test out that API without actually having to hit it, and things like that are quite useful because they also give you a more realistic view of what the API will look like.
So is that where you're looking for when you're going to a new API, when you're trying to consume a new API that's not yours, right? Are you looking for that OpenAPI spec? Are you looking for good documentation? Are you looking for mocks? Like, what are you looking for that makes you say, wow, this API is like, I understand it, you know?
So I will first try and find the API docs for whatever the API is. And if they look nice, generally there's an OpenAPI spec underneath. And they've got a tool that is generating out nice docs. So then I will also take a look at the spec. I will, for instance, throw it into a couple of different OpenAPI to code generators, because one of the difficulties with OpenAPI as well, we see this with OAPI CodeGen, is no two tools are equal. And so, for instance, like OpenAPI 3.1 came out several years ago. Can't remember how many years.
Yeah.
We don't have support yet because the primary Go library for OpenAPI doesn't yet have support because it's hard.
So you're saying there's a versioning problem, which is what we've been talking about this whole time. Yeah, okay. I understand.
And then, like, even then, it's, yeah, so some parts of the ecosystem don't have support for it. Some, there are, like, lots of nuances to OpenAPI that makes it really awkward to work with. And again, it goes back to, like, that conversation about technically correct versus what is practical. So you can write a really powerful OpenAPI spec that perfectly describes a load of conditional things that may or may not happen in place. But if you can't use any tools with that definition, you now have to go and write the code anyway. You now have to implement it all yourself anyway. So it's a little bit like, some of it is playing to like the lowest common denominator, while also trying to like nudge the playing field up.
Yeah. I think maybe a valid signal for OpenAPI is, and maybe it's different for others, but in my work experience, very few people are actually handwriting OpenAPI specs. I see lots of effort around.
I do that.
Oh, here's my Go code, and Go RESTful is an example where they have an open API generator from your REST mappings in code, where you write the code and then dump the open API spec from it, rather than author the spec explicitly. I've touched it a few times. Handwriting open API is tedious at best.
All documentation is tedious.
It's very verbose. It's very labor intensive to handwrite an open API spec.
I mean, writing YAML is just, especially like I've been at places where like the open API spec was like 3,000 lines of YAML. And I was like, editing that is a nightmare. It's terrible.
However, I agree. Writing it is not the best, but I still prefer doing that. And at least for me, it's so some of it's maybe ADHD and trying to get the thoughts across, and like I think through writing. I find in particular like doing that up front. What should this contract actually look like? And then not just like, okay, great, I've done some YAML, let's go. I then will actually like use an open API mocking tool, and that will then give me an actual representation of what that API looks like. And I've actually caught a number of things there where it doesn't actually match what I originally intended. But there is then that balance of, like, it takes time to do that. I could just go and write the code, but also like the code that I write may not actually be the design that actually we wanted. And so it's that balance of trying to give yourself enough time to actually work out what you want to be doing and what you want to be providing to your users. And I'd say generating spec from code is better than no documentation at all. And that's the other thing is a lot of people will just handwrite all the documentation, and that is painful to work with. It's painful to update and everything. So yeah, if you can generate at least some of it, do that.
And it's probably an outcropping from my experience, but I'd much prefer writing API specs in protobuf syntax than to go write an open API spec. I think it's the same thing with essentially a different syntax, but I find protobuf IDL easier to read and follow than OpenAPI.
Even though I haven't done much protobuf stuff, I think I agree. Like of the bits I've seen, that does seem quite reasonable.
Yeah, and I mean, like I mentioned, even the beginning of my career doing COM on Windows, it was very similar IDL based, structured. This is an interface, and here are the methods, and here are the messages. Kind of it structurally similar to protobuf. So that was a natural thing for me, coming from COM IDL way back when, and then spent a long time doing kind of in the world of Magic, Microsoft Silverlight, a lot of .NET Framework stuff, where the mechanics of APIs were, you were insulated from that. Kind of you didn't have to think about the mechanics of APIs. And then coming back to Go after a long time and getting back into this idea of how do I define my APIs? Doing protobuf and gRPC felt much more natural than doing OpenAPI and HTTP REST.
How do we avoid like I'm all in favor of generating things, whether it's writing an OpenAPI spec by hand and generating code, whether it's writing code to generate the OpenAPI spec, or some combination in the middle of those. I am in favor of that, because when you have a very large API, it's going to be very tedious to keep that up to date manually, right? Like humans going in and editing things, it's going to be very tough. But when a lot of developers say I generate things, it's often a way of them saying I'm too lazy to care about this and I don't want to put any thought into it. And I've seen that where like the documentation for the foo API is like the foo endpoint manages foo resources. Yeah, like no duh, of course it does. That's what I'm calling. But I want more than that as a description. So how do you like balance that in your APIs that you're creating? Like how do you balance, no documentation or bad documentation or like good documentation? How do you like find that sweet spot?
So I guess like similar to code comments, I think if I got a PR from someone that was like, foo manages foo, I'd just be like, just delete it. Like, I would prefer to have no documentation than documentation like that. And yeah, like you have to bring people along on like the culture of documentation. As Ian said, like not everyone enjoys writing documentation, but it is very important. And to be honest, people are probably not going to read it, but for the few that do, it will be good. And as I say, I find that writing the documentation helps me have that empathy for the user. Okay, what are the people actually trying to get out of this? What am I trying to solve for them, more generally? And trying to get people in that mindset can help. Not everyone's there. Not everyone has that experience and that skill set, but it's something that everyone can develop.
Yeah, I definitely have found that I do a better job of it since I've kind of shifted to that mentality. Like documentation for documentation's sake, kind of the go linter warning, hey, you have this exported symbol with no comment, so we're going to yell at you. And people go write, foo's the bar. That's not a useful comment, but it makes the complaint go away. Since I've kind of made myself mentally shift to documentation is to explain to your consumers how they're supposed to interact with this. And then kind of taking it, like you said, Jamie, from the standpoint of if I go and your example of generating a client from the spec is like I've done that myself, kind of. If I take this spec that I've defined and then I generate the code and then I go try to use it, does it work the way that I think it's going to work? Do the semantics actually behave the way that I'm thinking they do? Or is it actually clunky and difficult to use? To kind of make that mental shift to, you're not writing documentation for documentation's sake. You're writing documentation as an instruction manual for how to use your thing.
Yeah. Kind of along those lines. I do think when I start with documentation versus end with documentation, I end up with a better design, right? Like, because writing the documentation first, to me, is like part of that design exploration. And it's the easiest way to think about a design, just writing the documentation. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I guess you should try to design first, but not.
Yeah, so I think that like, I think you all like. So what I wanted to say is that like I think the problem is like an upstream problem here, and I think kind of what all of you said are indicative of that. Of like, I think that you need to do like the abstract API design. Like I think part of the problem we have is that we don't do that abstract API design. We try and just implement an API, whether that's writing in some IDL or writing some open API. And then I think more importantly, we only implement one version of that API, whether it's in HTTP or in gRPC or in GraphQL. And I think that's part of the problem here is that we're not like gRPC, GraphQL, HTTP, even REST as a concept as a whole. Those are your transports. Those are your way of communicating with the thing you're trying to communicate with. They are not the thing themselves. But I think we treat them as the thing itself a lot of the time. And they're insufficient for that. They're not built for that. Like, there's no good way, I think, to write any IDL and have it contain enough information to be sufficient, because there's so much other stuff you need to document that really, I think, a lot of the time belongs in prose or needs to be added as some sort of extension, or we need to evolve the format. An example of this is I was trying to use GitHub's GraphQL API, and it's very well documented, and there's lots of information about, these fields mean this and these types mean this and all of that, but there's absolutely no information about permissioning. So I don't know if, say, a GitHub app can actually call this can call this GraphQL mutation, or if it can query for this field. Like, that information is completely missing, and there's not an easy way to actually go ascertain that besides actually building the thing and trying it out, which can be difficult. Or if you're talking about something like that actually charges you money, it could be expensive. And like, that information doesn't necessarily have to live in GraphQL, but it should live somewhere. Like, I had to file a GitHub support ticket to be like, can I call this API from a GitHub app? And they came back and they're like, no, you're not allowed to call this class of APIs from a GitHub. Okay, great. That would have been nice if you had put it somewhere else where I could have found it.
Or since it's a GraphQL API, you won't actually get a 403, you'll get a 200, and you have to go read the response body to get the permission error.
Well, yes, which is not technically wrong, but that's a tangent. So,
okay, no, that's a tangent we're going to come back to, though.
Okay,
we are going to revisit that one. Don't you worry. I am writing that down.
That is the most common source of table flips for me every time I touch anything GraphQL. It's like,
yeah,
it's a 200. Your request was processed successfully.
Okay, fine. We can get into it now because it is related to what I just said. Okay, so I was saying how you need to have multiple. We really should have like at least two, right? Like, I don't like that GitHub doesn't have equivalents between their two APIs, but they do have like an HTTP/REST API and a GraphQL API. And the reason I think that's good is that it helps you not encode the semantics of your transport into your API. And what you said, Dylan, is a good example of when people encode the semantics of their API into their transport, right? Because what 400 errors are telling you is that the HTTP request was, in the case of 400 errors, like malformed in some way by the client, right? 400 is for client malformations, 500 is something wrong with the server, 200 is okay. And the thing about GraphQL is that if it returns a response to you, and that response having an error in it isn't incorrect because the HTTP request was processed successfully, it just resulted in an error. But that error wasn't because of something at the HTTP layer. The error is because of something behind the HTTP layer in your business logic, right? So you said, this comes up a lot if you have like list of things or you want to process things in batches. If half of it succeeds and half of it fails, that's not an HTTP request failure. The HTTP request got through, it got processed, it was fine. There was something within the HTTP request at a lower level or higher level, depending on how you want to look at it, that was the error. And the place where that error message should be is not at the HTTP level, but at the kind of application level, which is the response that you get back. So it's, the request like failed successfully or whatever it is, right? It's that sort of thing, but it makes sense because you need to understand like the layering at the end of the day. The layering is important. And when you try and put errors at the wrong layer, you tend to start to confuse yourself about what you should actually be doing. Like, how do you resolve the batch conflict issue if you assume that HTTP has to be able to carry all of the errors you might have? Then you're like, well, we need a new HTTP status code that says partial success. But in the context of HTTP, that doesn't make any sense. Either the request succeeded or it didn't. It got there and was processed or it didn't.
That reminds me of going back to my Windows days. The database API in the COM days, everything was integer error codes. And there was a standard error code that was DB_S for success _ errors occurred. So it's a success code to tell you that errors occurred.
Back to like the HTTP version of it. It feels a lot like the content negotiation, where content negotiation is the correct way to do it. But you have to like cater to the lowest common thing, and people expect the error in HTTP. So like, is it wrong to do it because it's what people expect? Or like, how far outside the normal boundaries can you go with an API before it's like too much new information for a consumer to parse, right? Like, if you created a completely correct HTTP API like half of developers out there would get that in their hands and be like, this doesn't make sense. This is horrible.
Yeah, the pitchforks would come out instantly.
I mean, you could always, that's the thing about HTTP as well. You don't have to, like, HTTP and REST as a whole, but definitely HTTP is incredibly flexible. So you could say, okay, well, like, we're going to return errors unless you include this header that says, okay, we actually are going to do error processing the right way, right? Or you could just say, I'll just accept application JSON and we'll just run the regular way. But if you can send us this other thing, and we will, we'll be happier if you do it. And you can even link that into, like, if you want to use this crappy API, we're going to charge you more money. But if you do the right thing, we're going to charge you less money to incentivize people. But I think the big thing here is that it's not so much that people have expectations, it's that people have a default way of thinking about things, and unless you document and tell them explicitly that that's not how it works, they're going to go with that assumption. So I think the problem is less that people are assuming it works one way because they're used to it, and more that we haven't explicitly told them that this isn't how this thing works, and if you want to use it properly, this is how you're going to have to use it. And I think we need to not just go with the lowest common denominator all of the time, because that ratchets us down to a place where we're just stuck, where we can't evolve forward, where we're just kind of trapped for a long time, right? I mean, that's the issue with API versioning, right? Yeah, you can make a V2 and a V3 and a V4, but people will just sit on V1 forever, and you're kind of stuck maintaining that implementation detail for the longest time. And I think we as an industry need to stop being stuck because it's causing us problems, right? Yeah, people are using HTTP very wrong.
Yeah.
We should not stick ourselves in the mud because of that. We should start making the changes, because we won't in 10 years have people use HTTP right if we don't start now, even if it's hard.
Yeah. Before we go too far off of it, I do want to say I very much agree with your point, Kris, about separating transport from semantics. I can't even count the number of times I've had that just very similar discussions about kind of, you built this REST and it doesn't work gRPC, or kind of what I was talking about earlier, where people want to put database tags and JSON marshalling tags in their generated protobuf structs because they want to also use it for the REST API, kind of the REST and gRPC and various things, hand-coded UDP packets with your own hand-rolled serialization format. Those are all transports. They're how to get data from one point to another. That's not the semantics of the API. And what you're designing is the semantics of the behavior, not the mechanics of the transport.
Yeah, I think Jamie had something he wanted to say, but before that, I want to tag onto that of also, if there's something your transport doesn't support, you don't necessarily have to implement it. Like, it's not incorrect. Like, the reason I said GitHub's API annoys me and that the HTTP API and the GraphQL API aren't equivalent isn't because, like, there's things that GraphQL can do that HTTP can't do. It's because they can both do equivalent things. But if there was something that, maybe in a gRPC API is only doable over gRPC and you can't do it over GraphQL or HTTP, it's fine to have it that way and be like, sorry, this functionality can only be done over this one interface because this interface allows it. So I just wanted to make that point. Jamie?
Oh yeah, mine was, again, an early Unpop, which was off the back of you saying about, like, having issues with being on V1. So you should just stay on V0 and always break things and always keep pushing out breaking changes. And
I'm with you, man. I'm with you. Yeah. Like, honestly, if you can't be bothered to update your client code, then is it really load bearing in your system?
Yeah. V0.infinity.
I was going to ask a quick question around HTTP status code since we opened up that door.
Mm-hmm.
Deletes. Mm-hmm. I want to delete. I want to do HTTP delete. What's the idempotent way of doing that? Do I always return 204? Do I return 204 when I actually do the deletion? And then do I return 404 when, there's no actual deletion being occurred anymore? Or do I always return 404? What's everyone's thoughts around this?
I don't think there's a correct answer to that.
I think the default to blind deletes, like if you're trying to delete something that doesn't exist, we just ignore it.
And what do you send back to the client?
200.
Like,
or
200?
201.
Okay, I've seen people do 204s. I've seen
I'm
people do
kind of-
404s.
I'm kind of against most non 200 errors, like other than just 200.
I think the other 200 errors are very used, especially 201. I think 201 accepted is like a very important
Okay,
one.
fair, yeah.
That feels very
That's-
hand wavy. Like, I have received your request. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. Maybe it'll fail at some point in the future. We'll see what happens. That always
created?
felt like a
that's
very hand
202
wavy
accepted, not 201. No, it's not really. I mean, it's okay. This is another thing. It's only hand wavy if you see your application transaction as a single HTTP request, which is not how HTTP it works either, right? You have 202 accepted, and then something within the response that you get should tell you
How to find the status.
what the eventual status could be, right? Because accepted means like, hey, I got it, but I haven't necessarily started processing yet. I'll process it at some point. And you can give them maybe a location header that tells them where to find it. Or maybe there's a link header that gives them, but there's options. So you have to like add more to it. I think or in documentation, you say, okay, there's a 202 accepted, and then you have to get it on polling or something like that. Or we'll send you an email or whatever, right? But it's semantically telling you something that I don't think 200 encodes well.
Yeah,
That's fair.
Yeah, kind of to Ian's point, I'm kind of in the same camp. I've never liked the idea of returning an error code when you attempt to delete something that doesn't exist. Like, that's not a failure in my mental model. So if you send a delete is not going to be a 404.
Oh, no. What?
Yeah, I've seen people do
there's
it.
no not found for a delete of a thing that doesn't exist.
I've seen people do it where the first request to delete was the 204, right? Like no content because the delete, there was actually something to delete and the delete did happen. And then the follow request was a 404 because there was nothing to delete and it didn't do anything. And I'm like, that's not an idempotent API.
Correct.
Is it though?
Yeah,
I think it is the most correct. But
So I guess it depends on really how you want to see what a resource is. Like if a resource is like, if it's a thing that actually like exists within your database and you have now deleted it, then yes, the proper HTTP status code for anything you do on it should be 404. Like that thing doesn't exist anymore. Many resources conceptually aren't really that. Like if you delete like a user, you haven't deleted the person. So like, I don't know. It really just depends on how you want to conceptualize what a resource is, whether you want to send back a 404 or a 204 or, whatever.
Yeah. And I guess that's where it always kind of irks me is you send a delete for a thing and that thing is valid at the time that you send the request and the system deletes it. Then a 404 response becomes nebulous because does that mean you tried to delete something that wasn't there and it was a bad request? As in that thing you wanted to delete isn't a thing? Or is the 404, hey, your thing is gone now, so it does not exist?
Well, I don't think sending a 404 for a delete request that deletes something is correct. That seems incorrect because the thing did exist when you made the HTTP request. So you took the request, you did something, and now you're responding to the request. And whereas like a 404 is like when you made the request, that thing didn't exist. When the request was processed, that thing didn't exist. If in the process of processing it, that thing no longer exists, then that's a different status code. That's a different thing.
You know what? This is like, I like this question because it really makes you think about where the transport ends and where your application logic begins. And like, the more we talk about this specific example, the more I'm like, crap, at this point, I'll just send back the 200 okay with a response body and like let the user figure it out there. Like,
well,
because I don't know the answer.
Like the response body is an important thing, right? I mean, sending back 204 no content means there's like literally nothing. You can't include a body. There's nothing there. So in the case of a delete, sending a 200 and then more information is a good thing, or a 404 with more information is a good thing.
Also, I wanted to note to our listeners that Jamie sent us a link in the chat that I immediately clicked with no. I just clicked it. I was like, you know what? Yeah, I trust Jamie. I'll click whatever you send. And it was a link to http.cat / 200 or / 404 or whatever HTTP code. And it gives you a nice little picture of cats doing various things with those HTTP codes. So thank you for not phishing me. Or,
5 years at a security company trained me very well to not click on arbitrary links.
Yep, I clicked it so quickly.
HTTP.cat looks trustworthy to me. I don't know.
I'm saying.
I was going to say, would Kris have clicked it if it was http.tac?
Bravo, good sir. Bravo. Very good.
Now I want to go create http.tac and return 201 for 102.
Oh, wait. Kris just DM'd me. Oh, kick Jamie. Oh, okay. Sorry. No.
I mean, as long as if HTTP.tac loads in Safari, then I'll trust that it exists. But if I get like a TLD doesn't exist, then I don't know. Maybe it's something that only works on Linux or weird GNU distributions of things.
It works on a Mac if you install GNU tools.
Yeah, not if you brew install tac. Wait, I should check. Does that work? I don't think that works. I think you have to brew install
you
for
have to
utils.
install,
Yeah. So if I do like a brew info tac, I'm probably going to get like this thing doesn't exist. Which
is that a 404 though, or is it
how
a 204?
much research do I? Oh my god. Yeah, can't find formula tac.
I do think at the end of the day, we're talking about these status codes is like pick something and be consistent. Like, I think that's what really matters here, right?
Pick something that makes
as well.
Oh yeah.
Sorry. So like with the 204, I put this as a unpop earlier, but I'm burning through them. I would generally say don't do 204 no content because you're just going to paint yourself into a corner where at some point you do actually want to return some information. So doing an empty JSON object with a 200 gives you the chance to change your mind in the future without having to do like a V2 API, which we all know is chaos. So
definitely chaos. Is that empty JSON body like an array, an object? Does it matter?
I'd say an empty object,
okay.
And then because returning an empty array, I dislike APIs that do that. Like, give me an object that can then be extended with other things.
Yeah, and usually the delete case is usually one thing at a time. So, yeah.
I mean,
control counterpoint return the literal string null, all lowercase.
Oh God! Oh no! Return an anti-escape sequence or something. No.
So the spec does point out like a place where 204 is useful, which is like if you do a put, and then you can just send an e tag back. That's like the e tag value for that put, and not send anything else. So I think there's really, if your response only needs headers to indicate what the application should do or what the application can do, then I think 204 is appropriate because you don't need the body.
Yeah, I think that's valid. It's a success, and there's no content, so you don't have to read the body, and you can look at the headers. That feels like a valid scenario.
I don't know. I'm with Jamie on this one. Just avoid 204. Like, I've definitely ran into issues where, like, you're expecting it and something changed, and I don't know. Like, even if your spec doesn't say this will always return 204, right? People, like, once you start, people expect it, and they're gonna handle errors differently. Like, they're not. Yeah, I don't know. It just
this conversation has taught me that HTTP is a very, very interesting protocol that's very extensible in many ways, and even in the year of our Lord 2025, we still have not figured out the best way to use HTTP to its fullest potential.
And it's fairly ironic that the primary use case for HTTP now no longer involves hypertext whatsoever.
Oh, yeah. Don't open up that can of worms right now. Jamie, we're going to have to bring you back on to talk about that side of it.
HTML is very much hypertext.
Yeah, but there are far more things sending JSON than HTML at this point.
There's a lot of websites in the world. There's
There are
a
a lot
lot
of
of websites in the, and you know how many? There's a lot. I mean, yes, but also, you know, JSON should be hypertext, so that's JSON's problem, not HTTP's problem. But yes, although HTML is more hypermedia than hypertext these days. But yes. So anyway,
Wait, I have one question.
Yes.
How do you feel
Yes.
about non-standard HTTP status codes? Like one we
Okay.
use a lot is 499. Like not for the actual clients, but to know like if the it's client closed connection. It's what like Nginx uses.
I was gonna say, isn't that Nginx's code?
Yeah. And we use that like if the client does like cancel a request, we'll return a 499. Even though they'll never see it. But like all of our statting and everything picks it up.
I think if you have a kind of, I think this is where I fall too on like custom HTTP methods, is that if you have a constrained enough environment, or if you like understand, like if you as a server know that your client knows how to properly interpret whatever you're going to send back to them, I think it's okay. I don't think you should just send it back as if like, if you have to assume at first that they're just a spec compliant HTTP client, right? So they're like, okay, if you send me back this 400, I'm going to interpret it in the way of the spec. And then I think if there's something else, like a header or something that has indicated, oh, I have this expanded functionality, then I think it's fine to, use that expanded functionality that you were just told that it has.
What about non-standard methods?
That's what, yeah, I included that. Yeah, same.
Oh, sorry,
Like,
I didn't hear
as
you
long
say-
as
I
you-
was reading a show note.
As long as things have indicated that they can accept this or they can process it. Once again, same kind of content negotiation problem. But as long as either inbound or out of bound, it has been negotiated, I think it's fine.
I have
Fair.
So I think.
No, go ahead.
A few years ago, I was at a bank and we were deploying an API gateway internally, and I think that started returning some random error codes that they used internally, similar to like the Nginx one, and that just like broke stuff, both because clients didn't understand it, but I think there were also some like intermediate proxies and things that also didn't understand the status code, so everything just blew up. And as a little bit again like common denominator, try and stick to the things that people know and use, because
That's a very valid point. Unless your CDNs also understand all of your non-standard status codes, it's probably a bad idea.
Yeah. That's why you have to gate it behind a way that you know that the client will understand it.
And
you know
we're
that
back
there's
to
nothing
200 with response body that says something. Yep, we're just going back to it.
I have one more API design thing I'd love to talk about. And
Yeah,
that
go for
is IDs, right?
This part of the show is supporter-exclusive content, so if you want to hear what Ian has to say about identifiers, head on over to fallthrough.fm/subscribe. But with that, let's do some unpops. Who's got some unpops? Anybody got unpops?
I think Jamie has like 30 unpops.
Yeah, Jamie has a long list of unpops.
So I'm sure it was one of the episodes Angelica shared an unpop back on Go Time RIP, where she mentioned about like storing a list of unpops. So that's why I have so many prepared, because over time I have been thinking of them and biding my time.
It's funny because I'm reading Jamie's unpops, like the list, and the very first one is like, won't do them all or won't say them all. Yes, you will. You're going to say them all. Don't you worry. How dare you?
So I have one that since we're talking about APIs and transfer protocols and bodies, XML is good.
Yes.
Is my unpopular opinion. I know JSON gets all the love these days, and XML with namespaces with all the values as the content between the elements was admittedly terrible. But XML as a document structure I prefer to JSON for no other reason than the element names give you a hint of what it is, compared to JSON objects, which are just open brace dictionary of string names to values.
I mean, with namespaces, the element name tells you exactly what it is. And I will say, as long as you also use attributes where it makes sense, like I'm in favor of like namespaces, attributes, and if it's a value, put the value in. But I enjoy that. I like XML. It gives you that flexibility. You can include multiple different things in there, and you know what they mean. It's very defined, unlike JSON, which is just a soup of strings.
We did a lot of work in XML in my Windows days, and we leaned hard into attribute based XML versus element based, and avoided overly leaning into namespaces because namespaces are hard to manage. But we got a lot of mileage out of XML without dealing with all the terribleness that was the SOAP protocol.
Yeah. XML gets a bad rap because of SOAP.
Agreed.
I do like SOAP that it's like self-describing though. Like I
Well,
don't
let
like
me tell you
using
about
SOAP.
REST. Sorry.
Like
Not wrong.
You like the aspects of it that are like it tells you about itself, which is nice.
yeah, like a REST API, I have to go find the open API spec and everything. Like a SOAP API, I can just request the WSDL and I have it. Is that how you say that? WSDL, WSDL.
Yes,
Yeah,
WSDL.
WSDL.
Shudder again.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be pedantic. A properly designed REST API, however, you would just have a nice little spec you can go read, which is basically a WSDL. It could be machine readable if you want it to be, but you would have that, and that'd be nice. That'd be nice,
Yeah.
but no one designs APIs that way
I
because
tend to do kind of the analog for protobuf APIs, where as part of building the system, you can generate the binary file descriptor, which is kind of your compiled API definition. Go embed that into your binary and include an endpoint that returns that descriptor.
yes, yeah, oh, that's good.
Then someone can just ask you for, hey, what does your API look like? Here, it's...
Okay, Jamie, did you decide which of these many unpops you want to unpop?
Yeah, at the end of January, I wrote a post about the new Go tool functionality that's coming in Go 124 that is now out, obviously, because it's March.
If we ship this episode early, now you're going to sound weird.
Yeah. First rule of Fight Club: don't talk about time. No.
Yeah, so I wrote a post about the new Go tool that's coming as part of Go 124. And I was really excited before I wrote the post. I was less excited once writing the post, once I actually got to play around with it. And I still posted it with the positivity, but I think it's not quite where it should be. And I think most people aren't going to use it. And yeah, I've also seen lots of angry people on Reddit and Hacker News who are like, Go's getting so bloated, and who even asked for this? And it's like, well, lots of people asked for it.
I will definitely agree with you that it's not great. I was excited about the feature. I've used tools.go with a plus build none lots of times to have references to build tools in go.mods to make them straightforward to use. I've used it a lot, so I was very excited about the idea of that being built into the toolchain. Then I went and read your blog, and yes, it's not quite there.
So I haven't read how it works or your blog post. What are the issues?
So, have you seen like the tools.go pattern?
Yeah.
So one of the key issues with that is that it then adds indirect dependencies on all of the it adds a direct dependency for the tool that you're requiring, and then pollutes with indirects. And the problem with Go tool is it literally does the same thing, but there is an additional directive in your go.mod to say, and this module is a tool. So you still have the indirect dependencies that are polluting everything. I think the main positive that I'm taking away from this is the fact that with Go 124, they're now caching things that are either through GoTool or through GoRun, as far as I'm aware. So the idea will be that even if you're using the old tools.go, you will get a performance boost, whereas before it would recompile your Go runs each time. So it will be a bit better, but yeah, I think it's
I'm not really a fan of the idea of having to run Go tool in the name rather than run the tool itself. So the pattern with tools.go is you have the reference in your tools.go file, then you can go install the name of the tool in project dir bins, because don't go install into global directories. But then you can just run the tool in your build script, air quotes, whatever the case may be.
So I would disagree that that's the pattern. And I would see the pattern as running Go run of the module path. Because then it definitely is 100%. You literally can just git clone and run like Go generate, and then that works. However, by installing them ahead of time, you get the performance boosts and everything. But then you still have the problem of, if your Go generates then call a binary, how does that binary get installed?
Yeah, I've kind of, in recent times, I've moved away from using Go generate for those kind of things. We got bitten pretty hard when they fixed, air quotes, the security hole in Go generate, where you could Go generate, it would run arbitrary command, including things outside of your working directory and things that haven't been verified. So it was a valid security concern, but we had a lot of Go generate directives that were running local scripts and local binaries that started failing.
All right.
The other thing that we kind of ran into is Go generate only accepts a single command, and the particular thing that bit us hard was running a script or a tool in another internal repo, but you want the version, kind of the same problem I brought up in the fall through channel in Slack, where you want the version of the tool that goes with the library that you're using. In GoPath days, you could just run GoPath source foobar thing dot whatever. If it's packaged in a module, the path is in your module cache, and you need to go list with a -f to get the path to the module on disk in your local module cache to then get the thing to run. You can't do that in a Go generate because there's no bash subshell to go run the command and get to do 2 steps. So we ended up doing a lot of work to kind of pull those kind of things out of a Go generate directive in the code into just a generate make target.
All right. Matt.
Unpop. Yeah. Mine's very quick. My unpopular opinion is that you should not use single letter CLI options in your documentation. So when you're like writing docs to show like your CLI usage for something, and everyone just uses a bunch of single letter CLI options, don't do that. It's not well documenting. Now you're just forcing your users to go look up the help text for your CLI to see what those options even mean. use the long options if they're available.
60 years of Unix man pages disagree with you.
Sure, but a lot of them haven't even thought through what those options mean. Like a lot of people just say, oh, I'm going to use -I to mean pencil. And it's just like, what? Have you thought about any of this? Similar to what we're talking about, the API design, like think through the design of your CLI too, and don't just choose an option because it's convenient for you to type. Choose an option because it's semantically meaningful for the CLI design.
And to be honest, when I saw you starting typing this one, I thought you were going to end as, don't use single letter CLI options, full stop.
No. Yeah, no, you should definitely use them. But when you're documenting something for others, use the full options. It helps them like get a picture of what that CLI is doing. Otherwise, you just lose your reader, right? Like -I, -v, -this, like nobody knows what that means. Image, intent,
Especially
ignored.
when they differ depending on the operating system you're on.
I could go hard unpopular. I could go hard unpopular and say use / instead of -.
Ew.
All right, Windows over here.
But no. No, thank you. Yeah. Okay, Dylan. That's Ian, do you have an unpopular opinion?
I do. I don't know. We're talking about API design. So for URL parameters, it seems pretty popular to allow like a comma separated list as like, $ID equals 1, 2, 3. I think I prefer like the spec compliant ID $ID equals 1, and then a second one, ID equals 1, ID equals 2, ID equals 3. Like, I think I prefer that. Just, it's...
The spec also allows plus. So that there are some parsers that will take ID equals 1 and ID equals 2 ampersand ID equals 3 and will turn them into ID equals 1 plus 2 plus 3.
Who does that?
I've seen it a few times.
I don't know. I think I just prefer not having like comma separated lists places. It just gets messy.
That's fair.
I don't want to put a parser in my
Exactly.
parser.
I don't want a second parse step. Just let the parser do its thing.
Got my query string, now I got to parse again. Yikes. Okay. All right. Well, I don't have an.
A lot of people don't even know you can do that. Like put the same value more than once.
Yeah, you can do it with headers as well. So for some headers are not allowed to be specified more than once. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think I said enough on popular things this episode. I don't need to say anything more. Or I can just say, use HTTP properly. You're all wrong. People should just learn, and the world will be a better place for it.
If everyone in the world would just act the way that I want them to act, it would be fine.
It's not even that. It's like if everybody could just follow the specification and follow what REST actually means instead of what someone just made up, and then the author of REST was like, this is incorrect, and everybody was like, but we think it's correct, and it's like, okay, well, that's weird. Why are you doing it this way? It doesn't align with the values of the thing that I wrote. But everybody's like, no, we're going to steal your name now. Like, and we'll steal the name of the thing you made.
I will pull a Skeletor meme, and as we wrap, I'll drop Hadios and then leave. No, we're leaving now.
Oh, no.
Just call it the hypermedia constraint. The fact that Hadios or whatever, hypermedia as the engine of application state, like, you don't know what that means. You don't know what that means. You don't know what those words mean. You don't know what that sentence means. Stop using it. It appears exactly once, I think exactly once in the dissertation. But like, just call it the hypermedia constraint.
Jamie shared a URL in chat about like, can we please stop saying just? And I was literally having this conversation with a friend yesterday about like, we hide so much behind the word just implement I'm going on a tangent. I don't care. I'm tangenting. Just implement the API. Just read the code is the worst one. Just read the code. No, I don't want to just read your code because your code is garbage and you don't have any documentation. And if you couldn't be bothered to write documentation for your code, I'm not going to be bothered reading your code because you clearly didn't care about my time. Why should I care about your time? And that word just is so frustrating and it hides so much complexity, and it's just like it's an excuse for not formulating a proper thought. and like documenting what you're doing. Just do the thing. Just leave. Okay, I'm done. I'm done.
I will definitely concur. It is so painful to wade into 200,000 lines of air quote self-documenting code.
Yeah.
Okay, we can't go on any more rants.
I know. I'm sorry.
We're already at 2 hours of recording.
Yep.
So we just,
Jamie, where can people find you?
yeah.
jvt.me/elsewhere is the best place. It has all of my links. Yeah.
Perfect.
And with that, viewers, listeners, as always, please like and comment.
Just like and subscribe.
Oh no. No. Oh no.
Like, comment, share, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, hit the little notification bell, and reach out to us on social media. Do you agree? Should we use just? Should we not use just? What do you think about all our opinions about APIs? Are we wrong? Do you think we're wrong? You can reach out, or you can send us a letter. Once again, I think by the point this episode ships, everybody will know what the PO box is. So just send us some things. Send us some letters, some nice things. Once again, nice things. Just, oh my goodness. Okay, we're done.
New tagline: Tangents. It's what we do.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jamie, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Click the button. Click the button.
Click what button?
Just certified mail, please.
Ding. Not that button. The stop recording button.
You said the button.
I wasn't specific. I'm sorry.
You didn't say
Just click the button.
Okay. I'm clicking the button now.
It's the sun.
Somebody that I used to go. Ding.